evening, everyone, and welcome to our third event in the BioLit Talks Perspectives on the Gut series. I'm Sophia Sandali. I'm a PhD student in infection biology here at the University of Glasgow, and I will be one of the chairs for this evening. Thank you very much to those of you who are joining us, both in person and online. It's nice to see some familiar faces as well as some new ones. Once again, we have a diverse and exciting panel joining us tonight, and we will shortly be introducing them to you. But before we begin, I will, as usual, say a few words of introduction to the event as a whole. So BioLit Talks is a collaboration between researchers in the life sciences and humanities here at the University of Glasgow. We host events in which we bring together scientists, academics in the humanities, and artists, and we share perspectives on a common theme. So we have run events discussing infectious diseases and discussing the role of language in science and literature. Earlier this month, we launched our new series, and we are looking at the gut. So we had an event in which we looked at the gut microbiome, and then later on one in which we looked at the gut-brain axis. And today, instead, we are discussing the relationship that we have with food production and food consumption, and the cultures and thoughts that underpin these. And we try and have topical discussions in all of our BioLit talks, but today's one is particularly relevant. So just last week, the UN announced that we have officially hit 8 billion as the world population, hit 8 billion as the world population. And of course, this has implications in the urgency with which we need to contrast the climate crisis and the global food crisis. But apart from the obvious relevance that food has for sustenance, it also has a role in our cultural identity, our national identity, our generational one, and of course, cultural exchanges. So these are all things we will be touching on tonight. I'm very much looking forward to it. And I would now like to introduce you to Microbial Ecology, who's co-chairing tonight's event, and who is a doctoral student in creative writing here at the University of Glasgow.
Thanks, Sophia. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to briefly run you through how the event's going to work. We're going to start off with a conversation between all of our panelists here at the front. We'll have a conversation for about 45 to 50 minutes and then leave time at the end for questions. So if you can all be thinking both online and in the room of any questions you have, we will leave time about 20 minutes at the end for questions. Afterwards, we'll then adjourn. There'll be snacks and drinks outside for those who are sticking around. And for those of you who registered, Sean will also be running a workshop, which will be next door. And for those of you attending, please do pick up food and drink on the way through. It's very fitting for our event that it's available, so do not deny yourselves. As you'll have gathered from what I just said, we are running a hybrid event, so there are people watching online. Welcome to you all. So if those of you in the room can make sure your phones are on silent or ideally off, just so it doesn't interfere with any of the equipment, and everyone at home, if you can make sure you're muted. Also, everything's going to be recorded and made available after the event. Now I will introduce my speakers we have tonight. So next to me, I have Dr. Tiffany Mak, a research scientist working at the intersection of microbial ecology, fermentation, and the food system, currently at Novo Nordisk Foundation Centre for Biosustainability at the Technical University of Denmark. Next to Tiffany, we have Sean Wai Keung, a Glasgow-based food poet and writer whose poetry collection Seekman Glasgow was published in 2021 and shortlisted for the 2022 Kavya Prize. And next to Sean, we have Dr. Rhys Williams, a lecturer in Energy and Environmental Humanities at the University of Glasgow, where his work focuses on food and energy futures. Welcome, everyone. Great to have you all here. Now we can dive into our subject, which, as Sophia said, is more than a meal, exploring the culture behind food production and consumption. I think what it would be great to hear from each of you first in turn is a little bit about what you think kind of identifies our current epoch in food production and consumption and the way in which you're looking at it from your perspective. Which is kind of a roundabout way of saying introduce yourself and your research.
Maybe I should start.
Don't mind.
Yeah, so thanks again for the invitation, and I'm really excited to be discussing and being in this conversation tonight. As Michael said, I'm a microbial ecologist, and I call myself that these days, not because I was trained as like an ecologist, but more so because I think of ecology as thinking about the context. So I basically am very interested in the role microbes play in our food system. And microbes are tiny and we don't really see them, and yet they are basically the kind of conduits of all of the parts that makes our food system work. For example, plants puts nitrogen and it won't be able to grow as it is without microbes. Say for our cells, we can't digest a lot of the food if we don't have our gut microbes. It's very physical or previous conversations. So I really much think about the relationship. I think of the food system as in a systems perspective, and I feel like we often forget who is involved in the microbes are often also. So yeah. Stay.
Thanks. Who you'd like to follow on Sean, maybe?
Yeah, go. So, yeah, hello everyone. It's lovely to be here. Yeah, so I predominantly write poetry, but I also do a lot of things to do with community, community thinking, community workshops, community cooking, community eating together. And yeah, it all sort of revolves around this preoccupation I have with migration, to do with my migration stories, and how that might relate to different localities. So I'm very interested, for instance, in how different migrant groups throughout the ages have been able to adapt their tastes and their diets to what's available in Glasgow. And to sort of answer your question a bit more directly about sort of the epoch that we're in now, I do think we're at very much a crossroads of where suddenly, unlike generations before, we have so many things available to us. And, you know, so my maternal grandparents migrated from Hong Kong to the UK in the 50s, and they had to devise their own food with the ingredients they had available to them. Whereas now, you can get food from all over the world, just as an order online or anything. And then that sort of leads itself into questions around global warming, questions to do with sustainability and all that sort of thing. So yeah, it's sort of trying to figure out exactly how people can come together with food and how people's diets and cultures can interact with each other through food, but also, yeah, sort of looking at that in terms of possibly wider questions around, you know, that big scary word integration and that big scary word global warming as well.
Sure. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess my work is trying to think about the intersection of infrastructures and technologies and the stories that they tell and the kinds of politics that they embody and sort of bring into the world, and also the kinds of narratives that people tell in order to bring those infrastructures into being, right? So at this current moment, this kind of moment of crisis, food is obviously one of the key nexus points of that crisis. Food, energy, water, you know, the classic trilogy, I guess. And the thing about food that makes it particularly interesting is that we have, you know, the identity of the current epoch, if you like, is, you know, this kind of broadly, we imagine it as being this kind of broadly unsustainable industrial agricultural system, which is heavily fossil fueled and unsustainable because it's the product of this kind of historical progression from the 50s to the present, where, you know, we've lent into easy energy and pesticides and fertilizers and that kind of mode of farming, which has obviously a much earlier origin in some ways, but you know, really kicks off in the 1950s and 60s, the Green Revolution. So that's the picture of the crisis, but that's not the reality of farming around the world, right? We live in a kind of combined and uneven planet. There's lots of different kinds of farming going on around the world. It's just that this one is the one with the biggest press, I suppose, in some ways, and it's the one that the global north understands to be, you know, the way that you feed the world, right? And they have these narratives of efficiency and power and strength and domination and that kind of stuff behind it. So in this kind of moment of crisis, we're thinking about how to climb out from underneath that sort of teetering kind of like a cliff edge or structure, right, that we built up on top of ourselves that's causing the end of the world in some way. And there are different paths out of it. And the different paths, the different futures, the different narratives, that's what I find particularly interesting, because they have different infrastructures associated with them, different kinds of communities associated with them, different ways of organizing ourselves, different politics. The one that gets the most capital and influence and discussion at the UN level and so on is, you know, this kind of like techno-utopian solution to food, right? Which is like, which kind of proposes itself as a solution to industrial farming, but which is in some ways an intensification of the same logics, right? It's like a logic of control, a logic of domination, a logic of highly technologized farming. Bill Gates recently gave, in 2021, the speech to the Food Agriculture Organization of the UN. Bill Gates gave this like big opening lecture Food and Agriculture Organization, because the ways out are understood to be technological, right, and market-led in many ways. But obviously there are other options like agroecology, peasant farming movement, and so on, but these aren't as visible, and they have very different qualities, politics, and so on. So, I mean, that's kind of where I'm interested in, and that's how I understand the situation, I suppose. And I think it's really cool to have this spread of people, because, for example, the two, broadly speaking, two ways of seeing the future of farming involve very different relationships to microbes, in the first instance, right? And very different kinds of community, and different kinds of politics, like community politics, like who owns the food, who has control of the production of it, that kind of stuff. Yeah,
Where do you kind of see the future of food going from your respective areas?
I think I very much agree with what you're saying, that currently this is the state of where we're at. Like we've become so disconnected with our food system that, like, at some point, I mean, societies came together because of food. We went from hunter-gatherers to started cultivating things, and then it had a agrarian society. But that also meant we were physically in closer contact with our food, and also people were brought in closer contact to the source of it. And yet somehow we managed to really distance ourselves from that by creating these like highly industrialized systems. And as we've already like highlighted, that is not the solution clearly. Like we already see all these kind of problems, and so if we're driving this, like even removing ourselves further away from this connection, that's where the kind of problems like really manifest itself. So I see it. If I get to envision the kind of utopian future, I don't even. It's not even like a new concept, right? And I'm quoting a architect who wrote this whole book called Citto. Caroline Steele wrote this whole talked about this concept where she's saying that it's not utopia. She made up this word, Citos being for food, and then and the food place basically. And it's basically kind of reconnecting us to what are origins of society and why we came together in the first place. And I think if I had to envision like a future that is a lot more inclusive and that we are all part of it instead of having this very like distorted power structure, I would see that is like a way forward.
I'd just like to add a bit of hope to this as well, because in my experience, I do think that lots of people are thinking about this now a lot more than perhaps used to. And I think it's in part because of the lockdown. I think, people who maybe had never really thought about how they ate or how they bought things before, suddenly they were faced with this reality of, I need to prioritize what I need to buy, and I need to buy things for other people perhaps, and I need to eat with other people if I can. People were making cakes and breads and wanted to give that away to their neighbors. And I think a lot of that has led through to what's still continuing today. And I think there are lots of initiatives and groups out there who are actively trying to fight against this sort of domination that industry and politics tries to have on food. And so I do really think that I agree completely that it's a crisis, and that people really have to sort of start thinking about these things. But also I do think that process is happening at the moment. And I think in terms of the future, I definitely see more communal cooking happening, communal eating happening. I think that's one of the great things that has happened. During the lockdown, we had Glasgow chefs cooking for, cooking meals and then giving them away to people, the refugees in the hotels, and people sort of building outdoor cooking areas and community centres and that sort of thing. So I do think that there's a lot of good stuff out there, a lot of hope, and I would just like all that to continue, ideally.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting about this idea of change is that the community is also a site of knowledge exchange, right? So it's not just about passing out the bread, it's about sharing tips on how to make bread and things. And I think one of the challenges of the system which has been depicted so far in this conversation is that the knowledge has been cut off from communities. So understanding what is contained within your food, what it does for you. I mean, particularly you, I'd be interested to hear what you think about how this is how we can re-engage with our embodied understanding of what food does for us and what it needs to cook and eat good food.
Yeah, I think I guess this kind of ties back into the work I'm doing, and the reason I kind of picked food almost as a medium for the way in which I can communicate my research. It's kind of like almost like a chicken and egg. Like I find that like food is like such a kind of innate and fundamental language that we can all engage in. Like we don't necessarily need like words to describe or have. We can all be sharing a meal at the table. We can feel like a connection with that, and that's where I kind of started looking into it, and then and this is where the kind of microbes come in, because one of the lines of research I do is look into the microbial communities in fermented foods, not just because it's like really hip and I'm in Copenhagen, but it's also but it's like I went there for that, but it's also because it's a very cultural thing, and basically all different like all cultural traditions, I would arguably say, has like a fermented food culture. All the foods that we really enjoy and take a lot of pleasure in, like wine, chocolate, like coffee, bread, like a very fundamental bread, involves fermentation. And I think what is really interesting is when you then engage with food that was made by, like I often say that like basically they're like, it's microbial cooking, right? It makes things like much more tasty. It's also actually makes nutrients more available. And so by engaging with that, like it's you actually have a direct connection with other living like systems and beings, and you also appreciate a lot more what they are giving you, and you also have to think about what you give them. Another kind of concept I also really like to think about is that when we talk about like domestication or like agriculture, like we as humans like made these kind of decisions to make it easier for ourselves, but we also need to think about the kind of living beings that we're trying to ask, like help and work together with. And when we kind of change a way in which they are being grown, we also need to put care into it. And I think this kind of ties in with what Sean was saying about like hope and community. I think we really, another thing that's really important when we think about how do we cultivate this way of kind of bringing sort of communities together is this like idea of care. I think that is one thing that food really gives, and we always remember our like mother or grandmother or they're cooking for us, and I think that is one of the things that really bring the community together.
I think that really strongly ties into knowledge exchange as well. Right?
Yeah.
Like care often means knowing a lot. Like it's very hard or impossible to care for something you don't know anything about it, or the person or the microbe or whatever. Right? Care requires this kind of level of knowledge, and I think that's absolutely something that the kind of contemporary industrial system gets rid of or destroys. Right? I have a colleague in Coventry who was hoping to reintroduce various kind of regenerative agricultural practices to specific targeted farms in England. And the first step for him when he was designing the project was to get the farmers to kind of reconnect to their traditional knowledge. But the issue is that in this country, this is a sweeping statement, right? There'll be exceptions, but the people that he ended up working with, they didn't have what you would think of as traditional farming knowledge. They've been doing it in this way, for so long that was the level of knowledge that they had. They knew how to farm with pesticides, with machinery, with this kind of stuff, but they didn't have the what you would think of as like more traditional regenerative understanding. And I think the addition of that kind of technologized farming, one thing it does is strip away the intimate relationships that you need to develop care.
Yeah, and I mean, this all reminds me of, I don't know how many people out there know the Pollock Shields Bowling Green, but it's like a community centre in Southside, in a place that doesn't have much access to green space traditionally. And so a few months ago, they got chickens. And I remember going there when they got the chickens, and there were kids just running around going, look at that, look at those chickens, like naming them all. And then within a few days, the kids could actually go into the coop and see the chickens, and one of them went in there and found an egg and said, "This is an egg. I found an egg. Look, I found an egg." And they all went off and cooked it together. And it's for those kids, it was the first time that they'd ever actually felt that association with like a food that they eat hasn't come from a shelf or a supermarket or anything like that. It's come from that living being. And so through that, I think care is developed both in a communal sense and also towards food, towards animals, you know, if they're that way inclined, or even towards growing vegetables, seeing the process of which takes so long for vegetables to grow. But also there's that feeling of we grew this together, and it's quite powerful. It's really powerful just to sit around a table with a salad made up of things that people have grown, you know, let's say in a tenement garden together over a period of a year or something like that. It's really powerful, and I think yeah, that does link into the whole care, the whole care systems that have been going on. And yeah, also leads on very nicely, I think, so like things like fermentation. If that's how do we preserve these things that we grow together or that we make together, and then through that sort of those acts of preservation, it's also a cultural preservation in so many ways.
Yeah, like that also kind of one thing to add. Also, I find it really interesting when you interact with like fermentation and that, because we can see the ingredient or the food being transformed, and we engage with it through our senses. It's something that's like very innate to us, and yet like the reason we can engage with it is actually, well, that's kind of the microbes talking to each other, and also like sharing space, really, like sharing space in this like sauerkraut, and their communication we somehow are interacting with through our senses. Like we can taste, we can smell, it's like a bit sour. That's their like. If you go biology speak, you're like secondary metabolites and all these sorts of things, but then it's what it is, right? Like it's like our pheromones, you know, or we can smell each other. It's the same thing, and we're interacting with these microbes, and it just bring it like so much closer together, and for us to much like really interact with and think about that we are all connected, like but deeply connected in kind of that.
I think there's something really kind of fundamentally beautiful about the idea of preservation through change in that way too, right? Which is like really antagonistic to the normal like static idea of preservation, like refrigeration, freezing, that kind of stuff. Like drying, salting, fermentation, these more traditional methods, they preserve through alteration in some way. And as a result, are a lot less energy intensive.
It's interesting as well because you're talking about, you know, sort of maybe encouraging people to think about farming techniques and agriculture in the historic sense, but also I'm very aware of different people in different groups who are looking to grow vegetables or plants that aren't traditionally Scottish, but in Scotland, because, and like spreading that knowledge and say, oh, you know, with the soil we can grow okra, or we can grow this or that or whatever. And so it's preserving those methods, but through change, like you're saying there. And yeah, so how communication happens through that process.
I was going to say I'm quite interested in sort of this idea of change, because you've both touched very much on both identity and community, and obviously the way our society perceives change is both on an individual level and a group one. So where do you see the changes that we will inevitably have to have in our food production reflect themselves on both the individual level and the community one?
Wow.
I'll say one quick thing, I guess, just that the current food system centralizes ownership, right? So change could be quite literally understood as like devolution to the community or the individual level. Like if we're going to have, for example, so this is a little bit contentious, right? Because all of the stuff that I'm normally saying and thinking about is like sounds kind of anti-technological in a kind of brutal way, but it's not. It shouldn't be, and it's not, right? There are real benefits to many things. It's just the surrounding logic, the way that they're rolled out. You know, these are the questions that we need to think about, the politics of it, essentially. So things like precision fermentation of proteins could be amazing for the ecology. You could have like a really distributed, you know, a fermentation vat in every village, right? Like that kind of thing. But it would be about who owns that, who owns the genome, who owns the vat, who owns the right to make and distribute that stuff. So that would be one way.
Yeah, similarly related to that, I really do believe in the power of communal kitchens, and I think that's a way forwards that could be a really positive change, which is also, it means change, but also is sort of going back to some sort of idea of roots generations ago and stuff like that. But especially with energy prices, fuel costs, all that sort of thing, I think being able to have spaces that are just anyone can come here and can cook, and it takes away ownership from that kitchen level. And so much cooking is about what you have available to you, and so many times people don't think that they can that they can cook for other people, or that they have the space, or they have the room, or they have the energy. Whereas if you make it into a communal process and you have it be a space that's not centrally owned by anyone in particular, I think that does open up lots of possibilities there. And I think there's been an uptake recently, I think, in things like communal fridges and yeah, sort of like use. I mean, during the summer there was quite a few like communal barbecue type things going on. And so yeah, I do think that can be sort of a change that collectively could happen more going forwards, and it could benefit lots of people. I think. I mean, we have it bugs me sometimes. I think to myself, why don't libraries have kitchens that people can use, and like like, why don't we have like pans, or people can share different pans with each other? It seems so natural to me that that's something that we should all be doing. And so yeah, I really hope that change can happen.
Yeah, and I think this notional question about like the individual, like the community, I think is really interesting. Like recently, again, inspired by these similar sorts of community gardens or growing projects. Like there's another project in Bournemouth called a grounded, and they kind of build around they do run like education workshops and all these sorts of things, and talk about like the cultivation of like regenerative farming and cultivation of food, and end up with the whole intention of bringing community together. And one thing they really emphasize is that they're not trying to teach people and make them be self-sufficient. There's a difference between self-sufficiency and community sufficiency. And I think this like also ties back into the idea of ownership, like land, like, and our relationship with land. It kind of like moved from land being something of the commons to suddenly becoming a very kind of individualistic and ownership, right? Whereas if you're then kind of growing food for them all, like I think it's a fine line between how we think and we envision how we should do these sort of redistribution. And so yeah, I think that's
I'd really like a spice library.
Oh.
One meal and then put it on the shelf forevermore. Spice box.
Good idea.
I feel like it should be next to a perpetual stew as well. One of the things this discussion just now has made me think of is, I don't know if you guys have encountered the mushroom at the end of the world, the Avalon and how it's seeing book. It makes me think about the other things within that, as well as the discussion of land use. So it's about mushroom foraging and the way that is a kind of a sort of liminal space that is only subsequent to the searching of the mushrooms co-opted into like capitalism, which the mushrooms are processed and made into products. But it requires this common space, right, to happen. But I also think the other thing within it that's sort of important is the acceptance of everyone engaging in foraging, that there's an element of serendipity involved, which is also a relinquishing of control, which is also inherent in community. And I wonder how far you guys think that we're capable of relinquishing control with all of the cultural biases we have, and like what are the things we cling to the most that are kind of inhibiting us in that transition?
I'm making them easy, are you? One thing I would say is I have a slight concern about, so COVID and pointed out a lot of failures in the way that we live, and certainly kickstarted a lot of like really interesting and positive movements. But I think there is another side to COVID, or the consequence of COVID, I should say, which is something to do with purity and impurity and the fear of infection and so on, right? Like we have small examples of it from before COVID, like the horse meat scandal. Like there is something about the international global food system that is untrustworthy, right? And they try to cover it up with like branding and various stamps and so on and so forth. But like you don't really know, and a lot of those stamps are often revealed to be basically not worth the plastic they're stamped on. So there is something about a future of ever more like laboratorized, technologized food production, ever more sealed, ever more purified. That is really, I think, quite appealing to a lot of people. And I'm troubled by the political consequences of that desire. Like purity isn't usually a good political stance.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, really. I think it's both, there are like multiple layers to why this pure or like sealed off food might be appealing to some. One is convenience. One is then kind of like outsourcing the responsibility of a lot of these things. And I think I really tie back to also the notion of control. I think there's a level of control in there, right? It's hard, like our society has become very fearful of differences, actually. I think I don't think that like the cultural biases problem is not necessarily about different cultures like have biases against each other. It's more about this fear or like in another way of putting what our current industrialized food system is, it really celebrates homogeneity and like this like sense of control. And I think what we lack is what we need actually is this re-embracing like diversity and differences, right? Since when like a carrot is expected to be a certain color and a certain shape, right? Like and even that like very kind of physical quality of the food is not tolerated to be different. Right. And I think that kind of manifests itself into much more like deeper like problems in terms of when we touch on the power dynamics again in our food system, right? Where like then the sense of control, who sets the rules of what these labels and stamps are. And I think that's where I kind of it all like it's linked to the concept of this need for control and this intolerance towards differences or diversity, I would call it.
It's interesting because I mean, I agree with a lot of what you've been saying there, but also I think thinking about it from the perspective of, say, refugees or migrants, something like that. It's often it's the food that they cling to the food because it's so important to them, and it's a reminder of where they've come from, and it's memories of other places. And there's a really thin line there between that sort of the purity type thing and also realizing just how important something is to a particular culture or town or village. And it doesn't have to be in that context. I mean, I was in the Midlands a couple of weeks ago, and there was an argument about who makes the best oat cakes between different towns there. And it's like the people are very proud of the stories and traditions behind their food and cooking, and so there is definitely there's a real importance to spreading that knowledge and teaching people about different things, but it's about how that education happens, I think. And so often it feels like it happens in this very I wouldn't say dangerous way, but this way that doesn't particularly take into account the actual history of the culture of that food or that ingredient, and instead it's all about do this and it's authentic, and do this and it's inauthentic, and who are the gatekeepers in food and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think if education can be done on a more communal basis and a more direct basis, on a much more let's grow vegetables that don't normally grow here, or let's try this food that I haven't eaten before and let me appreciate it and let me hear the stories behind it. I think that can be positive, but yeah, I do think there's definitely a balance there between that sort of thing and then the whole this is mine, I want control over it, and this is authentic and everything like that. It's difficult to sort of have one without going too far into the other, but it's all about, I think, encouraging people to be proud of their food and to be proud of the stories around it. I think a lot of people don't think that their food stories are interesting. A lot of people don't think that they have anything to give, when actually they do. It's just about trying to talk to those people and encouraging those stories to come out and that knowledge to come out.
I think very much related. I think it actually really complements your comment to our kind of discussion around the current industrial system being very much like control peer based and then this thing about people recognizing that their story is important. And like I find authenticity such an interesting word. I mean, it's especially interesting in the kind of food book because authentic, there's like a tying into a certain kind of culture or like expectation even, but then it's also deeply personal. Like, is there anything that's ever authentic, right? Like we will all experience it, right? We all experience through our senses, and each of us have a different set of senses. Yeah. So I think that's like it's like very much related, and I think there could be something that could be built.
I think you can oppose the two ideas actually, right? I think that authenticity is, you say it's like impossible to put your finger on, but it's about meaning, story, and history ultimately. It's about the feeling of authenticity, I guess. And for me, purity, like the fantasy of purity, is about stripping away specificity, like stripping away history, stripping away story. Like the foods that people hold on to because they remind them of home. That's not a kind of purity thing, right? Purity is like a stripping away a thing which is the same everywhere, a thing which you know has come from like a controlled place, done in a controlled way, no chance of any other kind of well, impurities, I guess, like getting into it. You know? So yeah, I think those two things are almost opposed.
Yeah.
There's something interesting in there as well about what it is that's valued within the authenticity or whatever, because a tendency of this purifying process is to like ascribe a really like pretend specific value that is removed from its social, geographical, everything location. But actually the value is kind of a more living thing and it is attached to those things. And by detaching it in that way, we lose that sense of fluidity, that it is a living process. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we're kind of facing here is how do we accept that preserving this doesn't mean freeze drying it, it means allowing it to live on and continue to change shape. So I'm curious to see what you think about how that can be achieved.
Well, I'll give you a counter example, I guess, right? Or an example which is in your favor, I think, but just so for the sake of research, I bought myself 2 bags of Hubel. You know what Hubel is? This is being filmed, right?
Yes. Sponsored by.
Some free Hubel. And it's the furthest along this path, right? It's like it's powder, flavored powder, and it's got like a mixture of vitamins and minerals in it, and it's mostly made of oats, actually. And it's supposed to be like perfectly tracked to your needs, your like nutritional needs, I guess, and allegedly you can live on it, right? You definitely would want to, but allegedly you can. But I think that's the most removed from anything. Like that is purity. It comes in these like plastic sealed bags. It's like just powder that you mix with water. There's no tradition, no authenticity at all. It's like the brand that this is the authentic in some sense, right? And I was kind of wondering what you thought about this actually, because what's the relationship of that to like gut final, right? Like what does that do? I find that fascinating. Like what happens if you just live on that?
Yeah.
It has no impurity at all. You know?
So I think like from like a health perspective, it's been actually more and more people being more vocal and then doing research on it, that the food matrix is really important. Like there's a difference between eating an apple versus eating all the kind of nutrients that are part of it. You extract all the kind of sugars and like carbohydrates and vitamins like out of that. It's going to be different because you don't have like your matrix being the kind of fiber that kind of bring them together. It's also like in a way I find like being like quite these sorts of approaches being quite egotistical, that we have worked out what we need, every single like basic building block of like that would make us sustain ourselves as humans. Whereas I mean nature has evolved like for millions of years to like have this like discretized little package that like we very fortunately are able to kind of consume it or engage with and like get nutrients from it. So I feel like I mean not as I feel like there's a lot of research that points towards that we are maybe neglected. It's yes, there are nutrients that we can quantify, we measure, but then there are a lot of things that we're losing kind of or missing, that like as simple as the kind of physical interaction of like the kind of fibers slowing down certain absorption means that your blood sugar level don't just like kind of go up and spike, and all these sorts of things. And so like it's an experiment if you're going to consume something like human, and we're not right? We're going to get a cold. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because yeah, I guess when I think of let's say the process of eating an apple, it doesn't start with the actual apple itself. It starts with, do you buy it from a shop? Do you buy it from a greengrocer? Do you go to a community orchard and get it there? And there's this whole backstory to how that apple has ended up in your hand, going in your mouth. Whereas, I mean, I don't know what the process of getting that stuff was like, but I assume it wasn't as intimate. So it's interesting, thinking about this. It might be pure in the nutritional sense, but it's really impure, thinking of it from a social, historical communal eating kind of sense. It's very much anti-humanity.
Yeah.
I can say that. Sorry if anyone's watching the duel.
I think we're past that point. Yeah, I mean, it's a product of a kind of what I would think of as like a Silicon Valley mindset, right? It's like a kind of breaking down the problem into its constituent like parts and finding a kind of algorithmic solution for it, right? Like simple, this is like what we need, here it is in powder form. And you can see it not just in the product, but in the way that it changes your life, right? Like I was doing it for about 2 weeks, like just to see what happens, like write an article and see what happens. And I couldn't have lunch with anyone, right? Because I was like having, like they would sit and so it's very antisocial in many ways. It's for sitting at your desk, working, Elon Musk style hours, that's kind of what it's for, I think. Absolutely.
And your comments on purity and control and fuel and authenticity and links that we have with our food and our tradition make me think of new foods in general, because in one way we have been adapting to the foods that we are now consuming from an agricultural perspective. We have grown vegetables and fruits in certain ways, but also we are eating things like synthetic meats, or there's now the idea of consuming more insect-based products. And you've mentioned keyword as well. So how does eating new foods, this new food technology, impact not only our health, which you already touched on, Tiffany, but also our sense of identity?
I feel like that's a question that's very dependent on who you ask in terms of what kind of community, what kind of food history certain people already have. I'm thinking here in terms of, I know there are communities out there who still see, anything that's not meat and 2 veg on a plate as being, weird or foreign or something like that. And those kind of people will perhaps be a lot less willing to take that jump into new food as opposed to, maybe people who live in Glasgow and who are maybe much more open to different tastes. And so I always think about how the past can maybe inform this in terms of thinking about, once upon a time fish and chips was seen as like a foreign food, and now it's seen as the most British food in the world. And thinking about how sometimes these things are quite a slow process, and they do very much depend on economics and access. So I think, it's all very well having things like insect-based flowers and things like that, but are they affordable to every person? Can you pick them up and commonly share a bag in the kitchen, or a spice library or anything like that? And I think the more that we try and encourage those things and encourage an idea of access beyond just cosmopolitan rich people or anything like that, I think that will eventually help people to make that jump into new foods. But yeah, I do think it's quite dependent on where and when and exactly what kind of foods we're talking about. I think it is quite contextual.
One thing that's curious about that frame to me though is that you could also frame what you said as being a top-down or bottom-up approach, right? Communities are looking for the foods that are around them and to grow around them, whereas the top is imposing on you something that's industrialized and shipped into a shop that the atomized elites can go in and buy and take home and build into their integrated aesthetic. Like, this frame's totally different futures, right? This is like totally different ways of thinking about how we are going to eat and consider our diets in the future. Are you worried about either particularly? Are you excited about either?
I think I'd like to add, to both. Try to talk about, first of all, what do we even call or define as new foods, right? Like this, new foods. I think this touched on very early on in our conversation where Rhys was mentioning that actually somehow regenerative farming, or these a very kind of nourishing way of farming, is seen as foreign, is seen as very different to what we're used to, because we've somehow had this recent industrial history where food was just grown in rows of monocrops. You add a lot of synthetic fertilizer and pesticide to control, tying back to this. And so suddenly when we're even the way of growing food is somehow when it's something that's a lot more kind of innately or historically done, we've been so removed from it that suddenly a cucumber that's knobbly or like a carrot that's not that shape is like weird and new, like almost like arguably you can have that kind of distinction, but then also kind of tying in what you were saying about this top-down versus bottom-up approach is that and these ways of futures, right? Like these are like effectively what our kind of food futures would look like. There's no like kind of straightforward answer to it, but I also would say that the one that it leans towards a more industrialized approach or these centralized, I would say, ways of producing it's just a replication, if not like an extension of what we already currently doing. And it's also, we also see problems like coming, like manifesting from that kind of system. So it's almost kind of like, why would we continue on this trajectory if we're really seeing all these consequences that it's having, right? Like, it's almost like prompting us to be trying, like, even though we don't necessarily know that it might work, but like, there are a lot of good kind of evidence or like examples of it, like working really nicely if you think about value in a different way, that you don't just measure value by how much commodity, like how much capital you can gain out of selling that food, but like there are a lot of these other qualities that we've been talking about, like this sharing, this experience, this feeling of care, and all this sort of thing, and it's something that we aren't able to quantify, and yet it's very much important and intrinsic to the experience of food. And yeah.
The problem, though, is, like, hopefully my politics is quite clear about that, right? But like the problem of the focus that we have quite rightly on community and experience and meaning and all of that stuff is that at the level of global capital, it doesn't matter in many ways, right? And the companies, like new food companies that produce alternative proteins through fermentation techniques, like that kind of stuff, they broadly, the narratives they use to sell their version of the future broadly have two key components in, right? One, it's cheaper. The food is cheaper. So the mass production of this stuff will feed everyone, right? That's one of the key kind of claims. And it will do so in a way that is good for the environment, right? Because this stuff, it doesn't need as much land use, it doesn't need as much water use, it doesn't need as much energy use, it's fossil free and so on, if the things are powered by renewable energy. So it's cheaper, it's better for the environment. So three narratives, I guess, sorry. Cheaper, it's better for the environment. And cheaper, by the way, includes like sending philanthropic cargo over to, you know, suffering kind of global south communities, right? Like in photo ops and so on. Like bags of solein. That's the thing, that's on the internet. And then, so that's bad, right? That's like the contemporary version of gruel, essentially. You know? Here's your food, don't worry about it. All your nutritional needs answered in this bag, that you just eat that forever. And then the other thing they do is they emerge into our food culture invisibly, because they emerge into it. When you make this stuff, it's powder, right? It's formless. It has no particular leanings. So this is probably going to change, right, as the technology improves. But right now, the place that you see this stuff emerging into are like large-scale international like fast food stuff, right? You have pizzas, burgers, these things made using these like, you know, Beyond Meat or whatever, the alternative kind of proteins. As soon as they start making solein or whatever on a larger scale, it will initially be made up into things which you recognize and buy at a large scale, you know, on an industrial level. So it's not the success of it, the success of any future, sadly, right? I think anyway, the success of any future narrative depends on the extent to which it interacts with currently powerful actors and narratives and values. So the success, the promise of these new food technologies is that we don't have to change anything. You can still have your McDonald's, you know, you don't have to change your consumer behavior. So much of the radical kind of lefty answer to climate change involves people changing their behavior to some extent. And all of these involve not having to do that at all. It's the production side that changes. You just have to spend less and feel good about buying your McDonald's. So that's, I think, the thing that you're up against, you know.
Which I guess bringing in this notion of hope, I think, is where we could try and envision. Like, I mean, this is entirely.
So that's really down.
No, it's no, I think but it's a really kind of good check-in and a wrap kind of summary of where we are at, and what challenges that we would face. And I think this is where to kind of try and envision like a different future, how can we do that, and with like putting this element of hope in, and how to also we mobilize like everyone to feel not so like hopeless, right? Like this, we are basically at the mercy of like immense power structures. Instead, I think like what food can do is bring this agency, this like sense of agency. Like if you're, I mean, it's super satisfying, even if you just like grow from your like little pot like by your windowsill, like a tomato or like some herbs or something. And people who've tried like growing food know how difficult it is, but it's also very much satisfying. And then it's also like being able to make your own bread, or like ferment your own sauerkraut, or like other things that it actually doesn't take a lot of technology. And I think this is where a lot of these precision fermentation technologies came from, having to learn from like these sort of cultures. I guess picking up also on the comment on insects, like insects are eaten by a lot of cultures around the world. Like, and it's just like we just really need to powderize it so that we create this like invisibility kind of aspect to it, that we will be able to supplement things and again not change, right? And I think what bringing this kind of hopeful element to it, and how I can see it change, is that we want to mobilize people to want to do this change, to want to be part of this change, instead of not changing the current ways that they're doing things. Because like it's not a lot of the time people struggle to make their own food or grow their own food is because there's lack of time. Those times somehow commoditized, and this thing of like people, there's a lot of often these comments, it's like, yeah, you have all this very like utopic narrative of growing your own food, like raising your own little hens, collecting that egg. But ultimately, if you're working 16 hours, you just want to grab what's like the most simple and easy solution on the shelf, right? But what are these people doing working 16 hours? They're ultimately trying to earn money to bring food onto the table of their families and caring for that, right? So I think like a lot could be thought about, like how do we shape in the way we value things, right? And change that. And I think food has that kind of power to shift the way in which we engage with like power structures and dynamics.
I think it's also about like how we eat, and you know, I think it's in the people who make ready meals. It's in their interest to encourage people to eat alone, or to come back from 16-hour shifts and to eat alone. They want to pick up something that they can just microwave for 5 minutes and eat it. Or it's actually, if you're thinking about what is often cheaper, is buying things in bulk, and oftentimes that means that it's actually much more economically viable, so for people in a community to buy something together and then to cook it together. And so maybe, you know, there's an element of you come home from a long shift and there's some, you know, there's a pot or something that's on already for you there. But it is about just, yeah, not necessarily like changing how people think about the structures around how they eat. It's much more sort of about just like, yeah, really trying to emphasize that food doesn't have to be this thing that you do in isolation. It's not this thing that has to be done just to sustain yourself. It's not this thing that is just done to make profit. And you know, it can be something that we can all help each other with.
One of the interesting things, though, well, okay, what's good about that is that there's this implied challenge. There's that you found a like site of challenge where you can challenge this like conventional idea that what you're doing is grabbing something cheap and convenient, like grabbing a ready meal, when you say, okay, as a community, we can consider this. Now, we've talked several times in this conversation about things like climate crisis and change like this. Are there any like massive changes that are happening now where we might see similar opportunities to like be knocked out of that type of thinking and reclaim some sort of space to do these kind of challenges? Because it strikes me that that's the most fertile ground to like seek these changes. Fix the world, guys, please.
I mean, it's nice to think of climate change as not only posing challenges, but also potential opportunities. And what you highlighted before was very valuable.
There is an increasing movement towards what's the word? Like autarky, like self-sufficiency. I think there's a program maybe in Region 4 about it at the moment, actually. This idea that we're emerging from like a globalized, a push to globalization. The 90s, Labour, everything's going to get better, and now we're coming out the other side of it, right? COVID, climate crisis, all of these things, and there's a lot of positives about it because you can see it emerging in things like community movements, transition towns, the attempt to set up like local energy kind of production systems, right? Like community energy organizations, the growth of like food, like community food organizations, all of these ideas around self-sufficiency and sovereignty, ultimately, although too often it's been security. But like sovereignty and self-sufficiency, they have a lot of positive connotations. So I get that would be one of the positives. Although I'm slightly wary about the flip side of how that works, right? Like the retreat into kind of specific defined communities, well, obviously there's the potential for negative elements. But I think maybe that's one thing that's interesting, especially because from what you were saying, right? The idea of changing or of making people's food cultures more communal, or making people's food habits more communal, is cheaper, saves the world, and it's tastier, all of that stuff. But food culture is entangled with work, life, and I think if there is a pushback, it has to happen at the exact spot. So that the large-scale food companies don't want you to change anything, just to say the kind of individualized habits transform them into something like communal. I don't know how you're doing it, but there is a movement towards that kind of thing.
Yeah, kind of like I agree with that, and also adding on to it, and I like this kind of framing of it's both a challenge and an opportunity, because kind of see often like challenges or limitations. People get very creative. I mean, we saw it like during kind of COVID like times, like people became really creative of what they can make in their kind of like remain their pantry or like whatnot. And I think this is also, it also kind of prompts us to really engage with like what this current state is as well, right? Like, so with the pending energy crisis, we started looking at like, wait, why is this food product traveling like many miles to it when we can actually grow the same thing, right? And then it kind of like prompted a question, and when enough people ask questions, we need to find the answers to those questions. And I think that's where I see this like kind of interplay of like challenge and opportunity come in. And what's good is that there has already been work or people have like made a lot of effort in doing this, and it's now just for us to really engage like what's been tried and tested, also think that we can also be part of that.
Yeah, I'll just add to that as well, that as well as on the sort of individual communal ground sort of level, I do think over the last sort of 5-10 years or so, there's been such a backlash from general public about stuff like food waste and things like that. I do think that's quite a positive as well, and it is something that maybe just about reaches up to sort of a higher, sort of more globalized, capitalistic kind of level. And so, yeah, the sort of pushback and the encouraging supermarkets and restaurants to not waste food and to actually donate that to local groups. That is a positive. That's all come out of ground level public anger about global warming.
Interesting. We're now running a bit out of time. So anything else you guys wanted to ask each other or talk about before I throw open to audience questions?
No, I'm pretty sure the audience questions will bring up probably
I
new
thought
thoughts.
so too. One last opportunity. All right. So I hope that was all interesting for you guys, that it got you all thinking. Do we have any questions? Okay, we have two at the front here.
So there are other areas of the world where there's still a lot of dependence upon agriculture, and I feel that we are talking a lot about certain values or changes that we want to bring about in the Western perspective. But I was wondering how you would envision an information exchange with these cultures or communities that already have that intimacy there for us to be able to preserve.
Maybe I can start. I think I really appreciate that question, and actually that is one of the major things I try to address in my research as well. It's like but I think ultimately what your question asks is the narrative, right? I think it's not so much that we are saying that the sort of westernized solution is the solution at all. Like what we're trying to confront or address is that they are actually hugely problematic. And also when you then look at how food is currently being produced, the industrialized food system only feeds about 30% of the world, right? Whilst a lot of these smallholder farms are feeding the rest. But it's the narrative and the way it's been talked about that it's this there is a kind of negative way in which it's framed of these ways of producing food are seen as more backward and all that. And then so I think it is really important, and this is where I think what Sean mentioned earlier, talking about personal story is really important. Each culture and the kind of very personal experience, and if we can see more at the level that we all are sharing the same experience, that I think that is it's a mentality shift. It's not a technological shift that needs to change. It's more like a mental shift.
Yeah, it's so much to do with values, and a lot of the time, it's seen as the supermarket is a hierarchy above farming or agriculture, something like that. When actually, no, everything has value here, and it's all about how we can exchange those ideas and have those conversations between different cultures and different countries and different parts of the world. And it's not going to be simple, and there's probably going to be things that are going to go wrong at times, and people are going to mess up sometimes. But the attempt has to be there, and seeing the value of that communication and that connection there is, I think, pivotal to just how we deal with food crisis as a planet rather than just a country.
There are. I couldn't agree more with that. There are some organisations already, like the Land Workers Alliance in Britain, who are in contact with equivalent Global South organisations, and who do lots of knowledge exchange programs, learn from them. I think it also should be a kind of two-way street in some ways. Again, I'm deeply worried about a lot of the kind of technological advances, and if it's something like Bill Gates pushing technology upon particular cultures, like eradicating traditional ways of life against their will in some ways, opening markets for the sake of profit, and that's bad. But there is room, I think, for some technology transfer as well. Like agriculture is very labor intensive, it's very difficult. I think it's unrealistic to expect Britain to go back to a fully kind of labor intensive agricultural system. And it's possible that some areas of the Global South would quite like to not have that thing, right? So I think it needs to be a kind of discussion more than anything. But right now, you're right in the sense that the discussion is a little bit too one way, right? It's all about technology transfer and the knowledge exchange in the other direction is limited to what are fairly on large scale things, relatively small organizations.
Thank you. And another question.
Thank you very much for the discussion first. I guess my question is twofold, and I also have a bit of a comment. First of all, on the topic of how to have more communal ways of cooking and also serving food. I just wanted to say that there's actually a couple of really nice initiatives in Glasgow, but also in other parts of the world. I used to live in the Netherlands, in Utrecht, and actually there's a few grassroots organizations that say food from the trash. So dumpster diving is actually not as illegal as it is in this country. And then we would be serving that or taking it to communal fridges. There's a cafeteria in Glasgow called the Pink Peacock in the south side, where essentially you can consume food without paying if you don't have any money. So I feel like initiatives like this are on the rise. Now, I guess for me, the issue with this is that people who are mostly likely to get involved in initiatives like this are, of course, anti-capitalist in their politics and leftists, which I'm completely fine with. But in terms of talking about tangible and feasible changes, I just wonder how, if at all, do you envision the future of food within capitalism, within the capitalist system? And then as a tangent to that question, how do you also envision the move towards alternatives to meat, for example, as something that can coexist with traditional ways of eating and serving food? For example, where I'm from, we eat like lots of meat. I eat plant-based. When I go back home, there's only so much I can actually consume in terms of traditional food, almost nothing. So these two things, capitalism on the one hand, tradition on the other, and of course, yeah, sorry, it's a big question, but I would love to hear it.
Let's jump in first on.
I'll say, I guess in terms of the future of food within capitalism, you're mentioning there some groups who are doing really good stuff. One of them that came up during the pandemic was Empty Kitchens, Full Hearts in Edinburgh. And so that's led by a group of chefs from the hotel that basically decided, well, we want to transfer our skills to other people, and we want to take food that is otherwise going to go to waste, and we want to cook it, and then we'll just give it away. People, there was no means to it, so I don't believe that you could just sign up and you just got a meal a day, and it was made by professional chefs, and they were at the same time, as I say, transferring their chefing skills onto people who are volunteering for them. And so yeah, I don't necessarily I don't want to say all chefs should volunteer to pass on their skills and stuff like that, but I do think that there's room there for things to exist on a capitalistic scale, skill-wise, that can be directly passed on, or even stuff like I often think about the bureaucracy around food and things like food hygiene certificates, and the fact that people might want to sell things in their house that they can't because they don't have the right paperwork or license. And I do think that there are ways around that in the future. I do think there's a desire there for people who want to share. How that actually practically gets put in place, that's beyond my pay grade. I don't really know, but I do think there's a desire there for that sort of thing to happen. Yeah, I'm quite hopeful that it will.
Yeah, I'm building onto that and the comment first about capitalism and how do we shift this whilst capitalism is not going to go overnight, right? And how do we also make sure that people are not left behind, because it takes and at least I acknowledge that I have to be certain. There are certain privileges that I carry in order to be able to consume a certain way, right? Like having access to really well-grown fruit and vegetables doesn't, at the moment, existing capital framework doesn't not come with the cost, right? Or the cost might be also time or even access, knowing where to go, access to knowledge or that aspect. Well, I am kind of tying quite well with what Sean's already been talking about. There are ways in which we can it is linking to the notion of value. How do we value things, right? Do we these really great initiatives where they're sharing knowledge or sharing their time, they already exist, like you already highlighted. So one thing to kind of make it a little bit, maybe build a framework around is kind of to actually look more closely to why these things work, why certain supervisions work better than others, why that community garden is more effective than another, what are they doing in what sort of things are they valuing more, and that would allow this a more kind of fitting transition from or fits more well in this current capital framework. And then so that's kind of how I see it's not an answer, and I also don't have the answer to it, but I think this requires also people coming together and having this discussion. Right? Like I am in no position to tell this is what you should value. Like, you know, like you should value care more so than another, or you know, these sorts of things. It requires you to come together, come to like a group. So that's like my take on the capital side of things. And then in terms of like the meat side, I very much see that is they're also like, to take an even more extreme example, some regions in the current world like can't grow, like they can't grow vegetables. Like they use kind of culinary, like it's not suitable to be cultivating like plants. Instead, it's so harsh the environment that it's like livestock raising is like the kind of only way. And I think again this goes back to it shouldn't be a one size fits all. It's like respecting what like the kind of cultures are, but also acknowledging that we are the opposite without putting like another big word in this, but like now directly are whatever action that we do has a direct consequence, like ecologically to all these other beings that we're coexisting with, which like anymore we're eating, they're living as well, right? And it's also like really kind of seeing this relationship with like the kind of living world, like that we are not the only one. And so some changes we might need to adapt doesn't mean we throw away very rich cultures. But if a lot of these cultures are very respectful of how they would consume an animal, they would literally consume every single part of it. And so I think it's what can we learn from these cultures and then unlearn some bad practice that we've had, that we only see kind of a piece of chicken has to be in the fillet form, right? Like and not seeing all these other parts which are extremely like rich in nutrients as well. So that's kind of like
Yeah, I don't think there's much. I guess like the point of a tradition is that it changes over time, right? Preservation can change in that sense. So alternative meats or proteins will find a place, you know. I don't know if that's an issue necessarily. The tradition will change to encompass them in some way. I guess the thing that I do think about that is we talk a lot about food cultures and the way that they treat the animals and so on, and the way that they respect them. And I think that's slightly divorced from the way that we've been producing animals for the last 50 years, which is to say that the way that we've been producing animals has turned its kind of nose, in some sense, towards the industry that produces them, right? Like we don't make animals. Well, yeah, it's probably the right word. We don't make animals for flavor or for a particular culture. We make it so that it fits the industrial machine better, right? So it's more efficient. Like pigs are a particular size, their hind quarters are a particular size, they're fattened in a particular way, at a particular speed. It's like literally a production line. And that has very little to do with taste or use, whatever, right? So I think we can change one side of things, the other, particularly in the kind of ecological direction. We don't need to keep producing so many animals. Personally. The second thing, the capitalist thing, I mean, barring a revolution or some large-scale overturning, right, which is the narrative that you always fall into when talking about something so abstract and so dispersed. You know, barring that, whatever that is, and whoever produces that, I think that every moment there's a political decision to be made. So if a new type of food or a new fermentation technique or a new food production mechanism is introduced, there's a decision to be made about how it's introduced, right? What are the politics of its production? Who owns it? That kind of thing. At the moment, there's a growth of like urban farm movements. Some of them are community owned in partnership with like public authorities, and that's a kind of anti-privatized model, you know. And it's tiny in comparison to everything else. But it's one thing that can produce another thing that can produce another thing. You know, that's, as far as hope is concerned, that's the best I can do, really, right? It's like putting one foot in front of the other in the opposite direction.
Thank you.
Do we have any online questions? Nothing yet. Okay. Who else in the room there? Can we go back to the back corner?
Sure.
Have you gone there?
I
had a question, and everybody that is sitting there on the panel has been great, very interesting. However, I would like to direct this question to Dr. Tiffany Mak, if you don't mind. I switched to vegetarianism quite a while back. I still stick to cow's milk, and I believe that free-range farming is the best way. But I would like to know what you think of this product called corn. I'm placing no comment on it. I would love to know what you think. Is it uses some kind of fermentation, some kind of single cell structure? If I would just like to know what you think about corn.
I think so. Corn, for everyone in the room or in the internet ether who might not know, it's one of the oldest existing in the market mycoprotein. Myco being mushroom like derived, so fungal based protein. And fungi is very broad. You have your like button mushrooms or mushrooms. You also have yeast are actually fungi, but they're single cell. And then you also have this whole new like hit wave of mycelium and all these thoughts around that. They're also fungi. Okay, so that we're all on that page. So corn is made out of this fusarium, whatever, and they're basically like a fungi that has been studied for many years, and it's actually British, right? It's made in the UK. It's also bound with other things. So from my knowledge, that the most like original form has some like kind of egg protein in it to give it that kind of texture and quality. And then now they have like a vegan version where it doesn't require the egg and binding. I know because of the history, it's been around for 14 years. It's been studied a lot, and there's like a lot of work that has been done to characterize like its safety aspect and all these sort of digestibility and what I guess it will have the most like long-term health study if there are any. I have to admit I don't know if there are like enough of these. So that's my comment to like what it is to describe what it is. And then like kind of commenting on like what other kind of new foods have been mentioned. It's kind of like towards these sort of direction, but there are different ways of it. So these sorts of microproteins is like you make it, you purify them into this form of like just that. But then there are now different like new foods that consider only extracting one aspect from. So you have a microorganism produce that thing, let's say a particular protein. You then purify it and then only take the protein powder, and then you can then go and the weights in the gym. You know, like so there are different forms, but like what corn is, it's a more like it's the whole cell.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've heard that it can be somebody can have an allergy to it and a very dangerous allergy to it. That's the main thing I wanted to find out.
Yeah, so we all might develop allergies in different ways. One of the things that, because as a microprotein, as derived from like mushrooms, is that it like has a different cell wall. But and so the structure of it is made out of something different to plants, where it's like cellulose based. It's made out of it's built on like chitin, which is more in like culture. There's a difference of digestive like digestive like challenge, not necessarily in like a bad way, but it's just a difference. It's very personal, like and very much related to your gut microbiome, which is like all your other microbes that you're living with as well. So I think it's a short answer would be it's really context dependent. It really depends, but as what it is on the market, it's the one that's been studied the most. And I think I would point you towards, I think Imperial College has done a lot of like those research, so I think look into that.
Thank you.
Had another question in the court.
Thank you so much. This is amazing. Got some really notes, so I'll try and be succinct. So when we're talking about food futures and like utopian ideals and what we want to see, can I have a plea for hope of like how we see like the transitory like in between period from getting from here then? Because a lot of my work looks at food insecurity in Glasgow, and a lot of the community food projects I've worked with rely on donations, which are precarious. And it's lots like Tesco and Asda donations, and so the more secure or more utopian the food system gets, the less donations that food insecure people will receive. So yeah, it's a bit of a plea for hope of like what we would hope this transitory period to get us to the utopian ideal food system without letting people starve.
Okay, how do we get to utopia? Seems to be the question. I mean, let's take that one on.
I mean, it's interesting because like I mean, this relates to that and also to the corn thing, because the thing that's really interesting to me about corn is the culture behind it, or the lack thereof, and the fact that, like, you know, when it first started coming out, it was corn sausages and corn burgers, and it's like it wasn't trying to be its own thing. It was literally trying to imitate other meat, and that's so interesting when you think about the diversity and depth of culture that's in so many different vegetables and vegetarian dishes and cuisines and things like that around the world. And so, yeah, I think, you know, maybe a way to get towards a utopia is to really sort of think outside the box a bit in terms of what possibilities there exist with technologies or with what food is available to us, and to really make it exciting as well, and to not just be like, we're going to try and make a vegetarian version of this, but instead we're going to celebrate the vegetables that are around us. You know, we can grow nettles even, and like, okay, that's all we can grow around like in this patch of grass or something. Or we can make amazing nettle soup, nettle teas, and we can do all this sort of thing. And so, yeah, I very much agree with the aspect of hope there, and I think that there's so many different reasons to be hopeful, and so many different ways that we can use that hope to help propel us towards utopia.
I think to add on to that, like, and really building on this comment about nettles, I think it's what do we see as food as well? I think that's a really interesting like perspective, because nettles is often seen as a weed, right? Like, and yet it is super nutritious and actually probably more tasty than spinach. So I mean, I would urge you, if you can find a good source of it, to just be careful when you pick them, but then just salt it, do whatever you can. But it's more of like building onto like a wider concept of what we see and engage and think about as food, and it kind of ties back into some of our earlier conversations around this kind of notion of like control and who owns what, right? Like, and I feel like when people start being able to engage with like what's around them and kind of see that, oh wow, like these things can be edible, you feel, and this is also where the kind of I feel off the really hopeful kind of movements and organizations are often centered around growing on food, like urban gardens, community gardens, and then kind of doing this, and people can learn a skill as well, like growing their own food and realizing that actually doesn't take much to be able to even grow potatoes in your balcony, right? Like in a market or somewhere. And so like really empowering people to be part of like making, and then when they can make, they also share. And I think this really like sharing is such a great way of breaking people.
If you're at that level of precarity, I mean, it's really painful, right? Like, if your food supply is essentially the scraps of the industrial system, like stuff that won't get eaten at Tesco's, they throw it away. But if that's your source of food, then that's really hard. And I think maybe it's hard to think of a hopeful narrative, because what you're lacking is any means of production, right? You're literally existing at the beneficence or whatever it is of others, you know, of this large scale system. So I think if there's going to be hope, then it has to be produced, right? I don't know if everyone has access to, like, you know, that's great, obviously, isn't it? Like the idea of growing your own veg and keeping it in your flat or what have you. But again, I'm assuming maybe that's not always possible. So it has to be, I think, about ownership and production and the capacity for producing your own food in a kind of sovereign manner, whether that's like community gardens, whether that's bugging, Glasgow City Council to expand the amount of land that's available for that kind of thing. It's like a long, slow and iterative process, but I don't see another way out other than seizing the means of production. he said, remember. Like that is, you know, like that's got to be that, right? Because if you don't have that sovereignty, then how are you ever supposed to push back? Or even just in this case, where the sounds of it, you know, live from day to day, right? I don't think it's fair that you should be at the whim of that kind of. Thanks for the question.
Do we have any more questions? We have time for maybe one more. Okay, I think one over here.
So I wanted to know, basically, you talked a bit about how we would experience microbes by like scent and taste and things like that. And I wanted to think about how we could, how maybe our experience whilst we're eating could change like how we physically digest food, and like how maybe like how our physical experience could change how our microbes like work with our food, and whether that is that a thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that we still don't know, but it's also like very interesting question. Well, thank you. So I just want to like clarify. So like you're saying that the way in which we engage with our food, if we also think about where microbes come into it, does that change the way we interact with it in the sense of like nutrients, or like what's your main like kind of question?
So if you had like a positive experience whilst you were eating, or you ate in a community setting, would that maybe change the way that you physically digest your food?
Okay. And that ties in a bit more with that kind of, I guess, like gut-brain axis and that, yeah, I mean, say definitely, but there has been correlative studies that has been shown that there is a relation to, because it also relates to your state in which, like, whether you're stressed or whether you're like in a, you're feeling kind of in a joyful moment. And I think that kind of emotional state affects the way in which, I guess, it affects what sort of hormones you produce, what sort of, and those what you produce within your body, and those responses that you feel emotionally and in terms of feelings are also things that maybe like that the microbes can also interact with. And so then that has like a relation to then how the state of the microbe is. And so, I mean, we've all experienced like eating in a very rushed state versus like in a much more calming, like like an hour to have that feel, like you would digest differently, right? Like you are still you, supposedly, that plate of food is still that, but you have probably experienced the difference in that case. So I would say, well, definitely, and people are looking a lot into many aspects of it, like the way in which we engage with it, like senses, whether it's like just taste or like scent, or even hearing. And so, yeah, I think it's there's a lot we don't know about, but our relationship is very, very deeply tied with microbes, and like kind of to add to this kind of picture, or like take the picture of it, right? Like plants, for example, crops that we grow, it requires microbes in the soil to kind of nurture it, and that kind of nurturing just doesn't come, like they don't stay in the soil, they kind of become part of the plant, they migrate on into the plant, and then we then take, like, imagine like we grew a cabbage and there's like the microbes are in that, like beneficial microbes, and we take that and then we kind of make a fermented like sauerkraut out of that, and then we then eat that sauerkraut, and like think about that kind of connection is like super deeply connected, that, and then we're actually really connected with the kind of that living system and the ecosystem. And so I mean, that doesn't answer your question, but I think like it just kind of shows the amount of like connection we have, and it's a lot more than we think by this very transactional interaction, which I think we're discussing all these.
Yes, brilliant final question, brilliant answer. I think we're now out of time, so I should have to Sophia to wrap us up.
Yeah. There's definitely a few people I'd like to thank. Before I do that, if you could please remember to complete the questions that were in your chairs, and then feel free to just leave them on the chairs. The feedback is really important to us and to our sponsors. So first of all, a huge thank you. So first of all, a huge thank you to our speakers. Tiffany, Sean, and Rhys, it's been great to have you here tonight. Thanks for accepting our invitation, for coming here and sharing your knowledge and insights of the discussion. I also have to thank our sponsors, so not you, but the Glasgow Medical Humanities Network for sponsoring us with their Early Career Foundation Award. In particular, I'd like to thank Gavin Miller, Manon Diaz, and Christian Sarg. And I'd also like to thank the College of Medical Veterinary and Life Sciences. Their public engagement team has awarded us the Public Engagement with Research Funds Award. In particular, I'd like to thank Alison Caldecott and Suzanne Attentive. A big thank you goes to the public engagement team at the Advanced Research Center for allowing us to host the events in their space, in particular to Kathy Dillon. And of course, I'd like to thank all the other members of the Violet Talks team, Michael Beerwater, Theodore, Rachel Lewis, and Amy Bowie. It's thanks to all their contributions that we've come to life. And of course, a big thank you to all of you who have attended, both in person and online. We will have our final event next week, so hope to see many of you there, and I hope that's the chance to talk to many of you. So please join me in thanking everyone I mentioned, and unfortunately.